Mother, father, what's afoot? Only possum black as soot. Mother, father, where to tread? Far from possum and his head.
Matthew Holness's 2018 expressionistic psychological horror Possum is about the agonising and oppressive burden of trauma. The story follows a disgraced puppeteer called Philip who returns to his childhood home hoping to rid himself of his grotesque Frankenspider doll thing, only to confront his haunted past where he was viciously abused by his uncle Maurice. It's a fiercely enigmatic film, one that gives you subtle clues and implications as to the events that have plagued Philip's life, but without the catharsis of understanding everything. For one, we never learn why Philip was sacked from his job as a children's puppeteer, yet tapping into our societal unease, distrust and prejudice, the perception it gives us isn't a pleasant one.
It used to be my school.
Move on, will you?
I first mentioned Possum when talking about why Ghost Stories was my favourite horror film of 2018, and I've always been meaning to cover it. It's perhaps one of the most unorthodox horrors to emerge in recent memory, alongside another horror flick we'll talk about next week. Possum was adapted from Holness's own short story, published as part of the New Uncanny Tales of Unease, an anthology conceived around the premise of psychoanalysis founder Sigmund Freud's theory of the uncanny. Holness's story combined our fear of doppelgangers and puppets to explore a fragile, introverted man who channels his trauma into a puppet he wishes to destroy, only to realise he can never truly get rid of it. In the original short story, the puppet was composed of pieces of roadkill, whereas in the film, to ground it away from pure shock value, the symbolism attributed to spiders as a mascot for fear takes center stage, which admittedly is probably less effective to the crazy people out there who like spiders. Yet regardless, the film is an extraordinary homage to classical and expressionistic silent horror such as Nosferatu and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, as well as gritty 70s mood pieces inspired by early British PSAs from Holness's childhood that look to shock youths over topics like drugs, sex, and stranger danger. It has this meticulously crafted old school quality to it that delivers scares with such an incredible level of precision where, for the real die-hard horror purists out there, it's easy to geek out over it. It's all presented with a broodingly slow burn that only gives us minor glimpses of the titular possum that looms over Philip's turbulent day-to-day existence before finally unleashing it in all its disturbingly uncanny glory. The uncanny as a concept is easier seen than said because it's a mostly visceral experience. It's the phenomenon of something that looks so seemingly familiar, yet feels unnatural and alien to us. The thing is, there's only so many ways to articulate it in its most primitive context, that being, it's something that looks real, but isn't. However, in the case of Sigmund Freud, he argued that the existentialism caused by the uncanny called upon our deepest fears and taboo inhibitions. It reminded us so much of ourselves, the id, as Freud himself put it, the part of us that's purely instinctual, and tapped into our supposedly forbidden repressed impulses, which to Freud were predominantly sexual and narcissistic in nature. In a way, since the uncanny is technically unseen for what it truly is, for example being distracted by a puppet's eerily realistic features that remind you of yourself, it must be dangerous to our psyche and thus our existence as a whole. In the case of Possum, the threat is human, but metaphorically it's one that has become so distorted and mangled by emotional stress and instability that it no longer resembles something that feels human no matter how much it looks human. And this doesn't just refer to the titular puppet, but more so the world that Philip inhabits. Stylistically, it's borderline apocalyptic, purgatorial even, and when interacting with his abusive uncle Maurice, who even has his own creepy-ass puppet, both characters are so deeply disconnected from each other that even their human interactions feel distinctly unnatural.
May I have a demonstration? Before you kill it.
Can't kill it as a puppet.
To achieve this heightened level of tension, the film's two main actors, the phenomenally underrated method artist Sean Harris and classically trained performer Alan Armstrong, never interacted with each other off camera to avoid having any chemistry or rapport on screen. It goes against tradition to reinforce their strained abusive relationship, which is further compounded by Harris's powerfully expressive performance, where his actions always speak louder than the very few words he says.
Wait a while, my little child, for what is playing dead? Possum with his black balloons will eat you up in bed.
Delving further into the story, Holness presents it almost like a Brothers Grimm fairy tale. Each thinly disguised chapter is bookended by a narration of Philip's childhood poems that serve as another method for him to channel his trauma. As the film progresses, Philip's attempt to take control of his life by ridding himself of his trauma becomes increasingly strained by its constant re-emergence. Yet you could say, going back to Freud's theory of being distracted by the uncanny, the puppet itself distracts Philip from Maurice's increasing insidious presence to the point that Maurice seemingly hijacks the story when he narrates the final chapter instead of Philip, something you'd expect from power-hungry abusers looking to control their victim's life. While it's easy to see the puppet as a metaphor for trauma, it's just as much of a manifestation of Philip's entire identity. The tragic aspect of Philip's journey is that he seems to blame himself for his own trauma, and seeing him fight with it, burn it, run away from it, but always wake up the very next day face to face with it, compounds this inescapable self-hatred. Since the puppet has a head that resembles Philip, when we contrast it next to Maurice's puppet, which looks like him, the symbolism is also projected into what these puppets represent in a British context. Maurice's doll resembles Punch from the Punch and Judy show, which was basically a violent children's slapstick where Punch would usually berate a character, usually his wife, and then beat the shit out of them. In fact, in the original performances, Punch would even go as far as to murder certain characters. As you can tell, later generations saw it as glorifying domestic abuse for comedic purposes, where some critics even perceived Punch as somewhat always being justified in his actions. When you apply this symbolism to Philip and Maurice, Holness briefly explained that certain aspects of the story were inspired by the context of Jimmy Savile, a prolific English DJ and media presenter during the 70s, 80s and 90s who, after his death in 2012, was exposed as a malicious sexual predator and paedophile said to have been protected by a circle of elites. The reason I bring this up is because it goes back to what I said at the beginning about an unpleasant implication, but to go any further requires ending spoilers, so for some of you, this might be your last stop in the video. A recurring plot point established early in the story is a search for a missing schoolboy who Philip briefly interacted with at the beginning of the film, and it's easy to see how Philip becomes the immediate suspect, especially given how he seemingly blacks out after each encounter with Possum. However, in the climax of the film, it's revealed that his uncle Maurice had the child this entire time, and while it's a bit narratively underwhelming and predictable given there are literally only two possible suspects in the film, there's an argument to be said that it's not entirely as it seems. One of my interpretations is that Maurice is entirely a figment of Philip's imagination, in that Maurice died a long time ago, whether circumstantially or at the hands of Philip, and is another extension of Philip's inescapable trauma. The grim way of looking at it is that Philip is a victim who unfortunately became the villain. After years of childhood trauma, he channeled the actions and behaviours of Maurice because they became normalised to him, and extending from that, his attempt to get rid of Possum, which as I said is a manifestation of his identity, is potentially Philip trying to get rid of his victim complex. The main reason I sit with this is because of the unanswered question of why Philip lost his job to begin with, along with all the various suggestible locations he visits throughout the story that imply where he was abused. Throughout the film, it definitely pushes a paedophilic angle that's impossible to ignore. However, what makes this theory less concrete and subject to a lot of scrutiny is that I think our immediate suspicions are deliberately played against us to show how we tend to perceive strange looking people around us, the uncanny folk as it were. For example, the perception of seeing Philip creepily standing outside his old school and having a teacher tell him to piss off is pretty telling, yet in Philip's eyes he's innocuously reminiscing of his childhood, a childhood that was stripped away from him. He isn't actually hurting anybody. Really, all of this distrust only goes to reinforce the trauma left by an abuser. The world feels like it's out to get Philip and misrepresent him, and that's how Possum succeeds at getting under your skin. It leaves you feeling unsure and vulnerable, that you cannot trust anyone or anything, and it becomes a purgatorial cycle of trying to get rid of something that's forever a part of you. Possum treats abuse like a disease, one that does not just affect the victim, but the entire world around them, making that infected victim feel like a parasite unable to find help, trapping them in an endless isolation that gradually consumes them. I would like to believe Philip's reasoning for being fired may have been emotional rather than physical, but either way, that's not entirely the point of this journey. It's about giving a voice to the voiceless, those trapped in their own head, an endless nightmare, as a result of being dominated by a presence that lives on even in death. As the poems in Possum describe, it leaves you feeling black as sin, where the once familiar becomes the uncanny, and the fears that ignite us are the very things that drive us, whether it be into the light or all-consuming darkness.